You're probably not going to get a published this list these days of like every attendee to your event. But what you can do, especially if you have insider knowledge, is like know who the likely attendees are, who the historic attendees are. Look and see who are the other partners that are showing up. And when we look at those other vendors that attend, we look at them through like a vendor mindset, right? Because so much of the capabilities that we're going to sell are joint sales, are joint solutions, right? But if you have great understanding or at least assumptions around who's attending, you can send a very personalized, detailed message ahead of time saying, we're going to be here. This is what we're going to be talking about. I know what you're working on these days. This is where we suspect the overlap is. Do you have time to sit down, right? Like, can we make your life easier?
Revenue boosters, tips now in the fast lane. Watch your profits grow. Welcome to the Rev Up Podcast.
All right, welcome to the Rev Up Podcast. Today, we are joined by Tom Christensen. Tom, we're so excited to have you. Tom is the Vice President of Marketing at Striveworks. Striveworks is a machine learning operations company. It's a platform that underlies multiple applications for machine learning. They sell to defense, but also have commercial applications as well. They've grown over 300% in ARR over the last 2 years and just closed a $33 million Series A. So I'm really excited to get into it with Tom around how do they deliver that growth, achieve all that success. So Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we get into how you actually have all achieved those results, how did you decide to join Striveworks?
Well, I have been working in a few different regulated industries for a while now. And every time I get closer and closer to the heart of the beast, that is like AI, right? Like there's AI light, and I'm sure half of the technology applications out there have like a little piece of it, right? Like a little smart chatbot or something. But the more you stay in AI and machine learning, like the more you like get drawn into like the center mass, right? Like that sort of like event horizon black hole that is like deep machine learning. So this is now my third company leading the marketing team, being the head of marketing. And a couple of companies ago, I worked in healthcare and had a really great product. And the product had a smart chatbot in it, right? And I thought, hey, selling into healthcare, what could be harder, right? Like it's the super regulated industry. And then I moved into financial services, selling to financial services.
Even more.
And I was like, oh man, healthcare was easy, right? Like HIPAA, right? Like HIPAA pretends to be tough, right? Like selling into banks, they take it seriously, right? And that was one step even closer to like the heart of machine learning. Like we were creating custom algorithms to do various bespoke work for top asset managers, top banks. And then I moved and got the opportunity to work for Striveworks. And I was like, okay, well, so what is machine learning operations? No, this is the technology that underlies all of the other stuff that I had been selling previously. And what's more is we were now selling to government, specifically defense, which is not a customer that I had ever experienced before. Looking back at HIPAA, looking back selling to healthcare, selling to finance, that was, child's play compared to like the regulated industry that is like selling into government, selling to defense.
Totally. That must be so crazy. So what does that look like? How do you actually what is marketing to the government? How does that work? What channels do you use? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So in terms of like the marketing strategies, so much of it, again, you start at the start, right? So you're asking yourself the fundamental questions. What is the company doing? What is the service? What is the value that we're providing? What is the benefit that a customer is getting out of us? And so from a product marketing strategy point of view, right, like the nuts and bolts of that are still the same. You have to truly understand if you're coming into a company that already exists, right? You really have to triangulate the opinions of all the senior leadership, of all the people who are constructing the product and say, okay, well, from your lens, right? Like, how is this looking to you, right? Like, what do you think people are getting out of this, both from a hands-on keyboard perspective, but also, again, this is a B2B sale. Like, what is the value? Why is someone buying this versus building it? Why do they need it in the first place? And so, whether that was working with Striveworks, selling to financial services, selling to healthcare, that fundamental strategy, marketing strategy work, still the same, right? Trying to understand what someone's going to get out of it. Of course, taking that then through the internal channels, right? You have to develop that sales collateral, that internal sales training sales enablement material that's going to allow everybody in the company to get aligned and say, okay, well, I might disagree like 6%, but like I can get behind this, right? Like I can commit to this language that we're using, right? That's all in support of the direction. But the actual external execution, right, can look fundamentally different.
Totally.
Right?
There's a small number of people who could buy. It must be totally different.
Exactly. And so in the channels to which they have access even or subscribe to are pretty different, right? Like they're not reading the same trade publications. They're not as reachable by email, right? So when we talk about these things, really that channel selection, right? You're building all your content, you're validating all of your assumptions, creating all the case studies, all the material, right? And then you have to actually get them into the hands or get the message into the brains, right, of the people that you want to incept with your message.
Totally.
And for me, walking into defense, I had to rely a tremendous amount on the sales team, right? The people who actually own the relationships, and I have to have that one-to-one, either async communication over email, but ultimately have those conversations when they're talking people through the product. And so, although there was a touch of like account-based marketing, that sort of squad built of rev ops plus marketing plus sales. There's a taste of that at every place. It feels very, very real here in that we're not going to any account that we don't jointly understand and jointly share. And so coming in, again, new industry, new sales team, I was very much, benefited from the strong relationships that the sales individuals had with the target counts and the target context that we were trying to reach. So learning from them, understanding the lay of the land, how do these organizations work? How is the purchase cycle different, right? I don't know if you've ever, gone down the path of like what a government sale, how that purchase looks, but right, there are people who want the product. They are completely different from the people who have to actually authorize and fund that purchase, right?
It must make the healthcare year-long cycles look short.
Oh man, I mean, and just understanding where there are rules of the road, right? You can and can't talk to people at certain points of the conversation just to try to keep objectivity in the purchase decision. It's all, you're factoring that in as you go. From the marketing standpoint, again, right, that sort of like background hum of activity is still ongoing, right? We're still, hey, what is the best story that we have internally? How are we presenting it? Do we have all the materials? Do we have all the ammunition to supply our salespeople with the best possible story at the best possible moment, right? There's so much work on that content side constantly that you can be doing to make sure that everybody is just well equipped when they have the opportunity for the conversation.
Totally. I imagine TikTok is not the right place to find those folks in government.
I've really learned some like new logos in terms of like, okay, well that's the podcasts, right? There are certain newer channels, right? Like the podcasts and the digital publications, but hyper focused, right, on that defense buyer and that defense conversation.
Yeah. So what is the biggest channel that you're focused on as a marketing org?
Yeah. So I think the more regulated and again, the bigger these organizations are, the more that an events first strategy makes a ton of sense, right? We have a ton of digital content and we're putting out tests with different channels all the time, but events is here to stay. If you look at an events calendar for some of these organizations we're selling to, right, they have something every week, whether it's regional or hyper regional, right? International, there's stuff all over the place. And these are groups that you can reach in person and have an in-person conversation with, which when you can do that, fantastic. There are well-known challenges with the event strategy, which is number one, cost, right? Like not just the finance cost, but the time cost of executing well in person. It just differs so much than a digital-only strategy or a digital-first strategy.
Absolutely. So from a marketing perspective, you're supporting the sales team going to these events. How do you help them make sure they're successful? Like what does it look like to strategize or game plan an effective event from your perspective?
Firstly, it's understanding with, having this conversation of understanding which ones, right? You have to pick and choose, especially at a startup stage, even though it sounds, the numbers sound big on paper, right? You have to be smart with your investments. Are we going to the right show? If we are going, right, really dialing that expectation in of like, what size of presence are we going to have here? So having that conversation with a person who may be regional or maybe focused on one particular branch that they're selling into, a lot of these people, have had a lot of resources, right? Especially if they're coming from the government side. They've never had to like pick and choose what they're going to do, right? With, those taxpayer dollars, right? Go a lot farther than some startup dollars, right? So setting expectations and saying, okay, where do you want to go? And this is what we can do for a certain amount of investment, right? Having those conversations. And then just fully equipping them with, a kit in a box, right? If it's on the small end, or a really blowout show on the big end, but saying, okay, you are going to need, right, materials and signage and everything that we know about to talk through every aspect of the product, right, to different, let's say, buyers of different education levels, right? When we're talking AI, when we're talking machine learning, you can start the pitch, and within the first 5 seconds, whether you see like a glint in the eye or like, fish eyes, right? I can either accelerate this conversation and go deep with this person, or I have to bring this back to absolute basics and say, like, are you using AI at all today in any way, right? Like how much do we have to educate you within the next 2 minutes to make this like a viable conversation?
Or let's move on.
Yeah. And of course, target selection, the pre-show outreach, everything of the planning and communications nature, right? Like communication is the specialty of marketing, right? So how can I best give everybody the little pieces, little emails, and the talking points so that they can do their outreach effectively and set up those follow-on meetings where they're really going to shine.
Totally. So what does that pre-ground game look like? How do you set that up for success with that set up before the event?
Here, even more than any other company that I've worked at, it is conversational with the salespeople because, right, a lot of those people have the relationships internally. So this is not marketing saying, hey, I've generated a list on, Sales Navigator or some, Lucia or whatever tool you are, is of the week, right? Scrape together some names, you should, send this out. We can automate it, right? There are a few organizations and they're not making a new one, right? Like there's not going to be a new U.S. Navy, right? They're not going to create a new Marines tomorrow, right? Like there's only one, right? They have sub-organizations, they have programs that come and go, right? But for the most part, you could think of it as a much more static landscape of accounts than other industries, right? So truly understanding where the seat of interest is, right? Who wants these tools, where the seat of power is, who's going to make the purchase decision. So much of that is tribal knowledge, tapping into those salespeople, really understanding it down to the name, right? Oh, it's so-and-so, right? I've known them through working on this program for, 4 years. Also, that person's about to roll out. So who's going to replace them? So understanding how that is, that's a great input from sales. And so understanding, okay, how does this tribe like to receive their information? Do they like, sprawling white papers, just chock-a-block full of like references and details? Is it, 10 slides, no, each slide less than three words, right? I can tell you it's not the second, right? Like it is an information dense crowd. They want to know it. They want to be able to reference it. They want to be able to see exactly how it ties into a very matrix like set of other programs and other capabilities, right? They need to know that you understand exactly how you're going to be part of their solution set. So coming up with that story, coming up with the materials that support that story, and then again, that outreach, right? You want people to go busy.
So what does busy look like? So when you say go busy, what does that mean? What metrics do you have to think about what it means to prepare well for
Yeah. So when we are preparing for a show, one of the rules of thumb that we keep in mind is, where the value is created. Is the value created at the show, after the show, during the show? I like to think that 90% of the value you're going to get from any in-person conference or show is going to be developed before you go, right?
Oh, wow. 90%. That's bold.
I mean, if you think about how you actually spend your time at the show, right? You might be lucky to get a couple of passersby, and those passersby might be, equipped to understand exactly what your product does and also understand how it fits into their current tech stack, and also have the authority to either escalate it or advance that purchase, right? Like that is like a small target. However, right, you can do all that outreach mostly ahead of time. You're probably not going to get a published this list these days of like every attendee to your event in advance, right? It's usually frowned upon. But what you can do, especially if you have insider knowledge, is like know who the likely attendees are, who this historic attendees are. Look and see who are the their partners that are showing up. And when we look at those other vendors that attend, we look at them through like a vendor mindset, right? Because so much of the capabilities that we're going to sell are joint sales, are joint solutions, right? So it's looking out, reaching out, calling those people. But if you have great understanding or at least assumptions around who's attending, right, you can send a very personalized, detailed message ahead of time saying, we're going to be here. This is what we're going to be talking about. I know what you're working on these days. This is where we suspect the overlap is. Do you have time to sit down, right? Like, can we make your life easier? That's not earth shattering, right? Like that is not, we're not reinventing the events wheel, but a lot of people go into these meetings saying, hey, if we have, perfect execution at the booth and we have the great graphic and it's swirling and it's drawing everybody in, and we've got fidget spinners with like LEDs inside, right? Like that's really, you know what I mean? Like how many people have ever generated a sale from, a pair of socks with like a great graphic print I'm going to guess few. I've got plenty of socks and I've purchased none of those products. And so that's why we go in thinking like, hey, you got to do the outreach, multiple touch points ahead of time to the right people, and really find and really book your calendar so that when you go, all of those people have been reached, but they've all been reached with the right message, right? So even if you don't make contact, their calendar is full, whatever, they have seen, they've gotten a brand impression, they understand the value prop, it's going to sit with them. And if the timing's not right, the timing's not right, but you've already had those marketing touch points. And if it just so happens that the timing is right, boom, you have an isolated, 20 to 40 minutes that you can talk to someone in person, make sure you see that glint in their eye, and that they walk away from that event even more educated than they were before you ran into them.
Totally. I think it's a great insight. In-person events are great, but 90% is preparing and coming ready with the right meeting set with the right folks that you need to hit at the event, rather than just going there hoping to randomly bump into the right buyer.
It does happen. I'm not going to say that it doesn't happen. I mean, sometimes it's super fun, right? And especially if you can invest in an event such that you have a speaking opportunity, right? Which is not guaranteed at everything, but you have to think about how much you want to invest at these events, and if you can make it like a self-reinforcing, force multiplier where you have a booth, you have your outreach, and you have all of the other things that you can tack onto an event to really drive in that traffic and do things like that.
So how do you think about that? So it's your biggest budget line item as a marketing team is events. There's all these events you can go to. You can spend up to infinity on each of these events. How do you decide where to allocate that? I mean, obviously it's a big budget, but it's a limited budget. How do you decide where to invest that budget as a marketing leader? I mean, that it seems like a very tough problem to approach.
It's a challenge that will never go away, right? Because there are always more shows to go to than you can go. People have lives. I just discovered this, right? People have lives, right? Like you can't send the same person every week, right? Like they have kids, they have families, they have vacation, right? That's a shocker. But firstly, you're thinking about it as a portfolio, right? So I'm looking at the ROI broadly across all of my events together, right? Like did the program work? Because as we know, like attribution, especially like non-digital attribution it's such a challenge to evaluate, right? Especially if you're looking at this as like a shared investment with sales, right? As opposed to I'm marketing his own something and putting $1 into an event, right? Like how well did that dollar do? It's going to be very challenging to look back and find that history. So when we look at events, right, we really want to have a high certainty that they're going to produce, right? That they are going to either accelerate an opportunity, create a new opportunity. But I like to think about the level of an individual investment as like a barbell, right? You were either going to go there just enough to do your job, right? A body and a kit and maybe a turnkey kiosk, right? Enough to be there and enough to say legitimately via your outreach, hey, I'm going to be there, stop by, right? Someone will be there to have a good conversation with you, right? Or you can think about that other extreme, which is, hey, we're going. Not only are we going, but we have a center stage speaking opportunity. And also, if you missed us there, or if you like what you heard, there's a happy hour down the street that we're sponsoring. You can come not only meet us and our C levels, but meet, the celebrity AI and, people in your industry that you want to talk to. They're all going to be there. And also, right, like there's a zoo day tomorrow. And if you happen to grab one of the free beers, right, like look at the cup, right? There is a level of reinforcing that you can do by having a really deep, big, outsized investment in a single event. It really raises the level of branding. And, again, so much of this is, really executing well on true marketing fundamentals. And then there's a little bit that's just the glitz and the glam, right? Like it is just about creating the impression. It's about the optics, right? If you go big, you look, especially as a small company, a startup company, if you do go big, you have the opportunity of creating that sense of, dependability, durability that people, there's some skepticism around, startups, right? Hey, I would love to do business with you. Your product sounds very compelling and you talk a good game, but you're a startup, right? Like you're among a bunch of startups. You might not, a startup might not be here next year, right? Giving off the impression that you have that, again, that swagger, a little bit of that punching above your belt, right? Can actually pay off, but you can't do it every time, right? Because it's cash out of pocket.
Totally. I love that approach. Barbell makes a ton of sense. So MVP event, show up with just a limited booth, lowest budget thing you can do to be there and have the outreach and build the connections, or the big tier, go all in, glitz, glam, like really establish credibility. And that middle space is probably not worth it, and picking the right events to each with.
Silver tier, right? Like if you think about like who's pitched you on silver tier and you're like, man, it's 40 grand more, right? Or whatever it dials in to be. And it can also be such a drain on mental resources, right?
Totally.
Because the amount of effort it takes to execute at that level, right? Versus, gold, platinum, whatever you want to call it, right? It's still a huge drain. It's still a huge investment. It's still going to take up all of your mental energy, your whole team's time, right? Whereas if you go small, right, keep it controlled, keep it constrained, you can send a couple of people, you can take your foot off the gas a little bit, right? If you've got your message in a box, essentially, sales team will be equipped to perform well, and you can spend many, many more cycles focusing on the big outsized project that hopefully will have a lot of returns.
That's a great heuristic. I think it's super helpful, especially for anyone who's thinking about event marketing, minimum or huge, and that there's nothing in between, which is fantastic. Biggest or the smallest. So as you think about, you said it's really hard to do offline attribution. What's your heuristic personally for deciding an event is successful or not? How do you think about that?
Yeah, now, especially, when I was doing in prior industries where, there were more organizations, there was more fluidity in the number of accounts, right? We were looking at, contacts and leads, right? Like MQLs. So here we've moved very far away from MQLs, right? It's one organization, it's one sub-organization, it's going to be there forever, contracts come and go. But we really look at opportunities created and even more so opportunities accelerated, right? We should be walking into an event with a pretty good understanding of the lay of the land. Who's going to be there? What opportunities are even open, especially in the public space, right? Because they have to put out public, RFIs, and what's coming down the pike, right? So you probably have a little traction, or you know what's even open to you. Right, your real opportunity at an event is to make additional connections with people who have influence on that, who can help guide that purchase decision and really accelerate it, right? Like how much greater faith? What is my greater probability of close coming out of this event than was going into it, right? A lot of that, and I think we may have touched on that, is this sort of partnership mentality, right? We are going in there. And so not only are you looking for those conversations with that actual end purchase and end buyer, right? That end user and buyer, that end buyer might be over here. That end user might actually be, a couple of degrees away. Have you met as many people in both of those pockets? And also the people who are complementary to you, right? So we do machine learning operations, those cloud service providers, those data providers, right? Have we been able to talk to them in a way that's convincing to them that is in their best interest? Hey, when you guys are talking to these same people, does your solution sound as complete because you have this missing data layer, right? Or this partnership layer, this full complete solution that's going to help to drive your business. So I don't want to underestimate the value of those sort of channel partners and those partnership, that solutioning that goes on at events as well.
That totally makes sense. But it seems like conversations or created opportunities accelerated really is sort of the main thing. What does that look like? Do you have something in your CRM that talks to that? Is there how do you manifest that in terms of data? Because I'm sure it gets a little unwieldy, as you think about that, because it's sort of as far as I can understand it, a little bit hazy. Opportunities accelerated. It's probably hard to quantify.
Yeah. So when we walk out of a show and we look back and we want to see, what's real, right? Everybody wants to know what's real, right? Because all of these metrics, I was looking at an automated email that we sent out today, and I was like, oh, those open rates are great. And then I had to remind myself, open rates aren't real, man. Right? It might be a nice thing to look at, especially if you beat your goal, but only certain things matter. And number of people you talk to, badges you scanned, right? If you get a really aggressive person in there with that badge scanner, you just zap, 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 right? When you walk out of there, right, is that the number you want to focus on? No. And so when we talk to the teams that have gone to live events, what we want to know is, what is the follow-up action, right? Yeah, we have these accounts we touched. Okay, let's talk about those. In this next 2 weeks, what follow-up conversations do you have? Do you have something booked? Do you have something meaningful that you're going to send them, right? It really strips away any of the fluff metrics that can be inserted to feel good about our presence or to justify the investment. Look, it's okay to have opportunities with
follow-up. Yeah, that's it. It's just follow-ups.
Yeah.
How many follow-ups?
How many follow-ups, right? And how many personalized follow-ups, right? What's the level of engagement that you walked out of there with, right? Can we strip away any of the people that are just, from, I'm trying to think of in this last batch that we went through, the number of people from small municipalities in foreign countries. It's I'm sure that was an interesting conversation. The likelihood that we can and will sell to them at their budget point is that's not, we captured it. It's in the badge scanner, but is it real? Not so much.
Totally. That's awesome, Tom. I think it's actually a perfect bookend. So starting with this, event marketing is so existential as you get to a smaller and smaller universe of potential customers, and government is the belly of the beast of that type of thing. And it's been so great learning from you around how to make that successful. Number one, I learned 90% is before the event. 90% of the value is before the event. Ground game, touching people, making sure you're scheduled with the right folks, thinking about how to do the right events, bookends, right? The barbell policy of minimum viable presence or go big or go home. Everything you got, glitz, glam, everything. Speaking, happy hour, everything to look and be bigger to get that flywheel at that local experience. And finally, what's the value? It's funny, 90% is before and 100% of the value is what you do after. It's the follow-up, which is great. What has a personalized follow-up to that conversation is how you track the success of an event. How many of those are there that are accelerating these opportunities? Tom, this is great. I have a lot. I need to be spending more time on events, I think, personally. I think we all probably could and should. I'm sure that not always something that you're excited about, but it seems like if you do the right strategy, the way it sounds like you are, there's just so much value that can be absorbed from these type of marketing opportunities.
There is, right? You just have to be very judicious about it.
Awesome. Tom, this is really fun. Maybe we'll have you back on again soon as we continue to evolve.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tom.
Rev up your ears, it's time to ignite. GTM leaders bringing secrets to light. Revenue boost.